Let's start by bowing in. So welcome everyone to the Buddhist Path of Awakening course as we continue through volume 3 of the Profound Treasury of the Ocean of Dharma. These are, as we all know, or most of us know, digests, these volumes of talks given by Trungpa Rinpoche at the seminaries that took place over a span of 15 years, where he would take anywhere from 150 to 250 students away for a 3-month period, during which they would study the Buddhist teachings and practice a lot. There were periods of just pure practice, like Datun or week tons. And the first month was devoted to the Hinayana vehicle, and that's been digested into the volume 1, the Path of Individual Liberation. And the second month was devoted to the Mahayana teachings, which has been digested into volume 2. And the third month, they're the Vajrayana teachings, which have been digested into the volume 3 that we're now proceeding through. So Michael is going to start.
So, good evening, everyone. We are reading the second of 3 chapters here about the Trungpa lineage and the Tulku tradition altogether. This is new material to me. It's been very interesting to read. I think it gives us some context to understand. Trungpa Rinpoche and the lineage of part of a traveling party with a King Minyak, one of the kings in Tibet. Tibet was a very loose confederation of tribes with some central government, as I understand it, but really very loose. It was, in any case, this king was making a pilgrimage, and during this pilgrimage, when they were in eastern Tibet, the region of Tibet that later became Surmang, he was born. Trungpas was born as part of that traveling party. That Trungpa Rinpoche says, although he was illegitimate and somewhat resented, but at the same time was accorded respect as he was born into a family of some type of aristocracy, I guess, and was born as a prince. He was trained in the Nyingma tradition, and by the time he was 15, he'd become a very learned and powerful person in Trungpa Rinpoche's description. And then when even older, asked to leave his homeland and with parental permission traveled to central Tibet and studied with the 5th Karmapa, Teshin Shekpa, and received instruction in the Kagyu tradition. The Karmapa then sent him back to the region where he was born and told him to settle anywhere suitable for practicing and teaching. So with that, he built a hut of reeds and spent a long time in meditation practice, Trungpa says for 6 years, eating very little, and that nobody really knew who he was. But at some point, he felt ready to teach, ready to spread the Dharma and relate with students, and went to ask the Karmapa for permission to teach. And before even reaching the Karmapa, received a letter of some type from the Karmapa that said something like, "Don't come back, go ahead." And he took this as permission to begin teaching the Dharma. And so he returned to eastern Tibet. He then taught such things as the 6 yogas of Naropa, and Trungpa Rinpoche says the Anuttara yoga teachings connected with that. The 6 yogas are quite advanced practice dealing with things like inner heat or Chandali, ejection of consciousness or Poa, illusory body, luminosity, the Bardo teachings, and also dream yoga, working with lucid dreaming, literally waking up in the dream state. Trungmasi was also a holder of an important ear whispered or hearing lineage within the Kagyu tradition and received the complete teachings of Yidams, Vajrayogini, and Chakrasambhara, which are very involved visualization practices that Chogyam Trungpa actually taught his students Vajrayogini and Chakrasambhara, as well as a Mahakala practice. So it's said that some of these teachings in particular were had been kept in a single lineage, where a teaching is just passed from teacher to a single student for 13 generations. This was what Naropa had instructed Marpa to do. But then after 13 generations, they could be taught, propagated to others. They could be taught more widely. So he was heir to, some very significant teachings. And he was the first to transmit this particular lineage of Mahamudra more widely. He apparently became known as quite a great teacher and gathered large numbers of disciples. And the students wanted a name for his establishment, for his teaching situation. And he suggested they could name it after his reed hut that he had spent all those years meditating in. And since the reed hut had many corners, because I've never seen one built, but apparently in order to build something like that so that it stands up, you need a lot of corners, a lot of supports. And that's literally what Surmong means, many corners. As Trungpa Rinpoche points out, Trungmase did not seem particularly concerned with creating a glorious name. Again, he had many students. His public teachings could be attended by thousands, but he had 8 very close students known as the 8 mystics or 8 Tongden, which means literally someone who's realized. And closest of all were 3 students called the 3 idiots, one of whom would become the first Trungpa. Trungpa Rinpoche says they were known as idiots because they were so stubborn and so earthy that they did not flinch at anything at all. They simply set their mind to one thing at a time. When their teacher told them to do something, they just did it. So we can extract from that what we might. We could think of this as a statement of utter simplicity, of developing completely stable mind, non-wandering mind, and meditative equipoise. A statement about their confidence, or a statement about their devotion. It could mean all of those things. But the first, from one of these 3 idiots, then became the first Trungpa, Kunga Gyaltsen. So Kunga Gyaltsen was born into, again, a family of one of the local lords during the 15th century. And then his name, Kunga Gyaltsen, means all joyful victory banner. And again, Trungpa means attendant, as we talked about before. And as Trungpa Rinpoche says, ideally, when somebody serves their guru 24 hours a day, they begin to get some glimpse of the working of the teacher's mind. They begin to get messages and reminders of awareness and things like that. So the best way to develop is to be the guru's servant. So the first Trungpa, Kunga Gyaltsen, was again born into a fairly aristocratic family, as Tibetan culture went at the time. He worked with his father and was educated. But when he first heard the name of Trungmasi, he left his kingdom and abandoned his home to find this teacher. He settled in and spent almost 20 years practicing meditation. And when we talk about practicing meditation, they're talking about fairly intense practice over long stretches of time. It's, in thinking about the reed hut, I'm thinking of pictures I've seen of different Tibetan meditation huts that are really small. And the story is that some practitioners will even do things like tie their hair to strings so that they begin to nod off. They'll feel their hair pull and it will wake them up. So they spend hours and hours in meditation practice. So it's a fairly intense, devoted, quite amount of discipline in this practice. So he spent 20 years practicing meditation, and then at some point, Trungmase, his teacher, sent him away and said, "You've received enough of what I have, so now you should find your own monastery and teach other people." So he traveled around eastern Tibet and came to meet a local landowner named Adro Shelobum. think I'm pronouncing that right, who was a local landowner and had some kind of a fort, some kind of a establishment. While this first Trungpa, Kunga Gyaltsen, was traveling, he'd been repeating a line from the Manjushri text in which there's a phrase, firmly plant the victory banner of Dharma, which he repeated 3 times at the door of Adro Shelobum's residence. And so that line is now is repeated twice at Surmeng Monastery when the text chanting the name of Manjushri is recited. And also Trungpa Rinpoche points out that it became one of the slogans for Naropa University, translated as, "We firmly plant the victory banner of Dharma." So in any case, Kunga Gyaltsen was very well received as a teacher by Adro Shelobum and was offered the fort as a monastery, which Trungpa Rinpoche says he accepted without much interest, but he could rather continue to travel and teach. So that was the first in the Trungpa lineage, Kunga Gyaltsen. The second Trungpa, Kunga Sangpo, Trungpa Rinpoche doesn't say much about. He was also a traveler. He was also discovered as an incarnation by the first Trungpa, by the Karmapa. He didn't create a monastery, and he said there are very few stories about him. The third Trungpa, Kunga Osir, did accomplish something quite significant. He established a set location for Surmang Monastery, which was Trungpa Rinpoche, Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche's monastery before he was forced to leave Tibet. And Trungpa Rinpoche gives some description here that up till about the 16th century, generally speaking, the monastic life really involved kind of a somewhat nomadic existence where they would set up camps with tents, and the monks would travel in caravans. Actually, Trungpa Rinpoche says it was more grandiose than nomads, but that they were always moving. They'd have libraries on pack mules. They'd set up a large tent for the shrine, and they would travel to the highlands in the summer when they were not too cold, and move to the lowlands in the winter where the climate was more reasonable. So the practices were conducted in these tents, and new students would be instructed there. But that there was not a fixed residence or a fixed monastic building. So the Tibetan monastic system was not set in permanent dwelling places for several centuries, but actually functioned in tents. And with that, we have the story of the skull cup, which explains how the location for Surmang Monastery as a relatively permanent monastic setting came to be. Near the end of Kunga Osir's life, the Karmapa had a sudden insight, Trungpa Rinpoche says. He asked Kunga Osir to come visit him in central Tibet, where he told him of a prophecy by Dombipa. Dombipa was a tantric master who lived in India in the 15th century. And Dombipa decided to transmit his tantric teaching somewhere other than India, and prophesied that in 10 lifetimes he would go wherever his skull cup landed. So a skull cup is a traditional vessel that's used in different tantric practices. It represents prajna, and the amrita, or blessed liquor, that's in the skull cup is supposed to intoxicate extreme beliefs, so that it's a way of connecting to awakened mind. In any case, Dombipa threw his skull cup, and it flew across India and landed on a particular hill in the region of Tibet that became Surmang. So the Karmapa told Kunga Osir that he was the incarnation of Dombipa, and they should establish a permanent monastery on that site, which happened to be the location of the castle of Adro Shelobum. And since then it's been called Dutsi Tel. Dutsi means Amrita, and Til means hill. So Dutsi Til means hill of Amrita, or hill of blessed liquor. And beyond that, Trungpa Rinpoche says not that much is known about Kunga Osir. So that brings us up to the fourth Trungpa, sorry. But before John's going to present that, I'd actually like to show a video if I can. So this is a little bit of a technological leap for me, but I think I can do it because I found a video on YouTube about Surmang Monastery. So I think it would be interesting to see it. So let's hope this works.
I'm not hearing any sound.
Okay, so in any case, that's what I had come prepared to say and show. And John will take it from here. John, you're muted.
Hello, everybody. Just a couple of notes. I saw in that video structures. One was called Dechen Chilling. Dechen Chilling is also the name of a retreat center that is part of our Sangha in France. And then there was another name of a facility called Dorje Kyungzong, which is the name of a solitary retreat center in southern Colorado. So Trungpa Rinpoche brought those names here, as well as some others, I'm sure. Just wanted to say that when what Michael described as the period before people settled down into structures like these current day Surman, and the so-called monastic establishment was traveling, and it was called a garchen, which means literally a chen means great and gar means encampment. And Trungpa Rinpoche instituted a series of garchens here in this country. They were held mostly at Rocky Mountain Dharma Center, what's now called Drala Mountain Center, it used to be 640 acres of land. Now I think it's 900, northwest of Fort Collins, Colorado. And these garchens, people would go, and they would be a semi-military kind of event, living in tents, marching. There were camps, there were games. People would divide into armies and have all kinds of different strategies that they had to perform. And so the garchen was brought alive here in this country by Trungpa Rinpoche in the summers. By the time of the fourth Karmapa, though, things were settling down into establishments. His name was Kunga Namgyal, which means, Kunga means all joyous, and Namgyal is victorious one. And he was a well-known Kagyu teacher. And he actually was the only person in Tibet who received what is called the Shije tradition, associated with the teachings of Chöd. Chöd, that's CHO with an umlaut, or sometimes it's spelled CHOD, depending on the system of transliteration. I'm seeing a lot of lag in my image. Is there any problem from the point of view of the people who are listening and watching?
It seems to be okay.
Okay, great. Chöd is a practice that is still done today. I have a very close friend, the wonderful translator, Sangye Khandro, and her partner, Lama Chinam. Sangye is an American who went to India when she was, I think, 17. She's now in her late 60s. And she became a marvelous translator. Teacher that I study with, Khenpo Namdrol, will not teach to English-speaking people without her. She's really brilliant, and her partner, Lama Chinam, is actually a Rinpoche, although he's too modest and he only goes by the title Lama. And he advises her about points of lore that she may or may not know, but she's extremely learned. And why am I telling you this? Because she is a teacher of Chöd. Chöd is a practice whereby you visualize in the practice, not literally, cutting up your own body and offering it to the deities, to the protectors, to the universe. And there are a lot of musical instruments playing. And if you practice Chöd, you will play a horn or a drum or something like that. There's a tremendous ritual involving music and this visualization of cutting up your body. And if you want to read more about it, there's a wonderful episode in 100,000 Songs of Milarepa. I forget the name of it, maybe somebody knows, where he meets another teacher and they literally cut up and offer their bodies to each other and to the universe, and then reassemble themselves, according to this song of Milarepa, one of the 100,000. So Kunga Namgyal actually brought the Chud teachings into the Kagyu sect. Also, Michael mentioned earlier teachers who did taught their students Vajrayogini and Chakrasamvara practice. If you go up to, well, you probably won't be able to see it, but at the top of, at Drala Mountain Center up in Colorado, there is the stupa, the great stupa of Dharmakaya, which is a stupa in honor of Trungpa Rinpoche. This stupa is four stories tall. It's 108 feet. It's quite large, and it's full of beautiful paintings and statues. At the top, which you are not allowed to go up into unless you received abhisheka into these traditions. But at the top, I can tell you there is a statue. There are statues of Chakrasamvara, who is male, and Vajrayogini, who is female, in union. That means that they're performing sex, standing, about 8 feet tall. And that's at the top of that great stupa of Dharmakaya. So I've let the cat out of the bag. Maybe you want to receive these practices so that you can go up there and see those statues. So Kunga Namgyal, who lived 1567 to 1629, this is just before the Manchus took over China, the Manchu, and it became what became the Qing dynasty. So this is still in the period of the Ming, before the Qing. And he established 108 retreat centers. That's a holy number. Whether it was actually 108, who knows, but that's what it says, in haunted places. And he said, I just read what it says here about Chud. It says that the basic philosophy of Chud is that instead of asking for protection from the Mahakalas, the wrathful deities, or your guru, you offer up your negativities and your security. You ask the enemies of the demons, whoever they are, to eat you, to consume you. And usually this is performed at night. So this thing of cutting up your body and offering it to these wrathful deities. He says this, it says in the book, it says this practice is actually something that from a contemplative tradition extracted from the Prajnaparamita Sutras. How it comes from the Prajnaparamita Sutras, I'm not sure, but I haven't read all of them. I mean, the Prajnaparamita exists in different recensions. The one that we're most familiar with is the one that's in a page. It's called the Heart Sutra. It's the heart of the Prajnaparamita. But then there is the edition of the Prajnaparamita, the oldest edition, is in 8,000 verses. It's called the Asta Sahasrika Prajnaparamita. And there is a version of the Prajnaparamita in 25,000 verses and another in 100,000. So maybe it's in there somewhere. I'm only personally familiar with the Heart Sutra. He left the monastery with a white yak, is the lore, and that monastery became the central focus of society. And you have to realize that by the time of the Trungpa Rinpoche, the 11th Trungpa, to be the abbot of the Surmang monasteries was not just a religious position at all. It was a political and administrative position of the whole area. So Surmang was the center, almost the capital, of the whole area of Tibet that it inhabited. And to become a leader of the Surmang monasteries was not only a religious, but a political position. The Chinese emperor acknowledged Kunga Namgyal as a political leader and gave him seals, which Trungpa Rinpoche brought with him, and including to Boulder, and showed us these seals that were handed down. So Kunga Namgyal traveled around the country by himself on a domesticated white yak without horns, and with a wooden ring in its nose. And that ring used to still be in the monastery, as well as a thigh bone trumpet. They made a trumpet out of a thigh bone of a yak, and that was used in Chud practice to call the haunting evil spirits to eat him up. He was one of the great Kuganamgyal, one of the great teachers of the subsect called Nado Kagyu, which I am not familiar with. Trungpa Rinpoche didn't teach it to us. But it's connected with the Pure Land tradition, which is practiced in both China and Japan, and they worship Amitabha, who is the Buddha of compassion. He spent 6 years in retreat. This is common for great teachers to spend periods of time, vast periods of time in retreat, solitary retreat, meditating. And he meditated in a cave just north of Dutsi Tel, Amrita Hill. And he meditated there for 6 years, sat so still that birds made nests in his hair, and he became part of the cave like a tree. It says in the text, if you've read it. He had an attendant, but the attendant was nasty to visitors. Eventually, he collapsed and lost consciousness and woke up into a different frame of mind, crazy or enlightened. And Trungpa Rinpoche speculates that it was enlightened because he was more fearless and powerful. And he was a great student of Mahamudra, great scholar, wrote a 3-volume commentary on it, on Mahamudra. Mahamudra literally means great Mahamudra. Mudra can be a gesture, like holding your hands in a mudra when you meditate, but it also literally means seal of reality. And he wrote this 3-volume commentary on the Mahamudra teachings, which were the ultimate teachings of the Kagyu sect until in the 14th century, the great Karmapa Rangjung Dorje brought the Nyingma teachings of Dzogchen in as well. He was very scholarly and learned. He wrote 20 volumes on history and social science, was a great musician and a composer, and above all, he was a great contemplative. The 5th Karmapa, Tenpa Namgyal, lived 1633 to 1712, which encompasses the beginning into the Qing dynasty, the Manchu dynasty. The Manchus conquered China in 1644. And on their way in, they set up camp on the outside of China. And there are stories. The Manchus were like a killing machine, sweeping across Central Asia. And they would come to a kingdom and they would offer either you surrender or else we'll just come in and wipe you off the face of the earth. And many kingdoms just surrendered. And when they did, the Manchus would say, you have to give us a representative to represent you in our court. And that person will arrange for you to be sending tribute to us every year in the form of food and wealth and all kinds of things. Otherwise, we're going to come in and just obliterate you. So Tibet said, oh no, we'll send you a representative and we'll bow down before you. We'll surrender to you in advance. Please don't come in and raise our kingdom to the ground. And they did. They sent a representative of the Sakya sect, and he became a teacher who they were camped on the western edge. They did. And escapes me now, riding on horseback. And they'd be riding along talking as the arrow out of his quiver in the back. And the story goes too that when the Manchus felt that should them and take them down to the river and drown them. And it was not a good idea that you would incur Mongol to Buddhism. And the Mongols became Buddhists. But they were very, very fierce people. I was born into a noble family, trained as a teacher. And from this time on, the Kagyu sect, I'm head of the Kagyu sect, leader of that area. He was an expert on Kagyu sermon. And it says in noticing very intensively. And it's set up. He's incorporated into the monastery. He received, I'm not saying that correctly, a Mongolian title for spiritual goals had taken over China. Grew. Rang province was one of 25 provinces in the kingdom, although Tenpa Namgyal had a lot of power to spiritual welfare of the people, as well as taking. Under Tenpa Namgyal, the central government, who then came in, and Tenpa Namgyal was very affluent, rich, they threw him into prison with some of us in Chamdo, the district capital, and the local government was afraid of warfare, and so did not. First year of Tenpa Namgyal's imprisonment, the people were starving and cattle were dying. Rather limited history. So the powers that were approached Tenpa Namgyal practicing, and they didn't want to be disturbed. They were having a great time, and 300 million recitations of the Avalokitesh do. I saw that video There was some in that video. He was a nephew of Trungpa Rinpoche, and some text has given us text that he, Karma Sangye, found in Tibet. That Trungpa Rinpoche had in his monastery, volumes of commentary on the Mahamudra. So they were having, the government threatened, demanding they make rain, or else people demanded he be freed from prison, though he considered it his rain and then was freed. But he was pardoned and had to leave. So the fifth Trungpa was an imperial teacher, and he passed. All I have to recount was, and a recounting of the times that any of us have ever seen or experienced.
Mark?
Hi, everybody. Hi. I was just curious, did they really drink out of a skull cap, like the crown of a skull?
You want to handle that one, Michael?
I don't know what happened at one time. Now what you have are, skull cups made of metal that are meant to represent a skull. But nothing would surprise me.
But I'll answer that too. I have participated in tantric ceremonies where the skull cup looks like a human skull, and it's lined with red cinnabar. And the dutsi is put in there. There are usually two skull cups at these ceremonies, one containing alcoholic beverage and the other not, for those people who don't take alcohol. And at different points in the ceremony, one of the monks will go around with the skull cup in his hand and a spoon. And when he comes to you, you put out your hand like this, you hold out your hand, and he pours dutsi into your palm, and you take it and you put it in your mouth, and then you wipe it on your hair. This is the ritual. It also might interest you to know that this is an offering to the deities, dutsi, and it's translated as amrita, which means the elixir of life. However, dutsi is made up of the 7 unholy liquors, traditionally. I mean, this is the lore, which are, as what I can only remember some of them: urine, menstrual fluid, blood, and I can't remember the other 4. And the idea is that you're consuming this. You're not really. When I've been in these ceremonies, it's it's not urine, menstrual fluid, or blood, or semen. That's semen's in there. That's 4 of them. Also, there is torma, which is offered, which is food, and that's offered too. And that's made up of the 7 unholy meats, which are, in addition to excrement, cow flesh, elephant flesh, human flesh, and so on, dog flesh, and I forget the others. But you see what this represents is, in the skull cup too, is that you are consuming and turning into the elixir and very sustenance of life all the things which we reject, which we feel we can't have in our world, and which cause us tremendous suffering. This rejection of the so-called unattractive or unpalatable elements of life. And basically, we consume them in tantric ceremonies. So that you asked about skull cups.
Great answer. Thank you.
Huh?
It
You're
was
welcome.
interesting. Thank you.
Actually, torma, the offering that's solid, made up of the 7 unholy meats, is usually made up of, in point of fact, of barley flour mixed with all kinds of wonderful things and turned into these beautiful little statues. So,
Thank you.
any more questions? these chapters are they don't contain a lot of Dharma doctrine, but they are really resonant of the redolent of the culture from which these teachings came and in which they survived and thrived for, gosh, what is it, about 13 or 14 centuries in Tibet. Philip.
Could you comment on some of the stories that I've read about the early Vajra practitioners being outside of society, lower castes, practicing the Sharnagrams?
That's in India. What happened was that nobody really knows, but prior to the 7th century, Buddhism and Hinduism seem to have been very mixed together, especially when it came to tantric practices. And these practices, these tantric practices, were pretty, as you can imagine, just from what little I've told you already, colorful, to say the least. And they were often practiced in forests by yogis. In fact, I mentioned Sangye, Khandro. Even in modern times, those yogis were still there, are still there in the forests, often naked, doing very extreme practices. And she went and practiced with a group of them, or some of them, called the Nakpas when she was very young. Sangye did, by repute. I've never talked to her about it. The Nakpas means the black ones. Now, what happened was that about in the 7th century AD, these people and their practices began coming out of the forests. And in fact, there were great Buddhist universities in India. The three largest, one was called Odantapuri, another was called Vikramashila, and perhaps the most famous of them was called Nalanda. And it's said that Nalanda, at its height, housed 10,000 people. And they weren't just Buddhists. They were all castes. It was ecumenical. It brought them all together, although it was run by the Buddhists. And the Buddhist teachers, there were 4 primary ones at each of the 4 gates, north, south, east, and west. Naropa, before he left, was one of those primary teachers in his time, and he lived in the 12th century. These monasteries, in about the 7th century, the tantric practitioners began coming out of the forest, and their practices were incorporated into these great universities. And Tantra became part of the Buddhist establishment. About the same time, Buddhism was traveling from India to Tibet, starting in about, supposedly, the tradition has it around 620 under a king named Songtsen Gampo, who married a Chinese princess who was Buddhist and converted him into Buddhism. And he began bringing Buddhist teachers from India into Tibet. And in fact, there was no written language at that time in Tibet. And he sent one of his ministers to India to bring back the written language. And this minister, whose name was Tunmi Sambota. How about that? Where does that come from? Tunmi Sambota. He went to India and he brought back the Sanskrit alphabet, which was adapted into Tibetan. And that's why Tibetan, although a totally different language than Sanskrit, is written with the Sanskrit alphabet, much like English, French, German, Spanish, Italian are written with the Latin alphabet, the Roman alphabet. So Tantra came from India, from the woods in India, into the great universities and around the 7th century, and it flourished there, and eventually made its way to Tibet. And that's what I know. And of course, the Buddhists rationalized Tantra and created well, especially the Tibetans, created the three yana system that we study, where Tantra is part of the third yana, the Vajrayana, also called the Tantrayana and the Mantrayana. These are all synonyms for the same body of teachings or bodies of teachings that moved from India to Tibet. There's a whole story about that. And then in the 11th century, starting in the 11th century, the Muslims invaded India, conquered northern India over a period of about 100 years. And part of Islam is that there shall be no images like Buddha images. And Buddhism was a very easy target because it was largely monastic. It lived in the universities and in the monasteries. So the Muslims were able to raise Buddhism off the face of India very quickly, relatively quickly. But they couldn't do that with Hinduism because it was in the villages and the property of the common people wasn't visible. That's enough. Hope I haven't swamped you. Jane. You're muted, Jane.
I'm trying to make some connection. So when we say the talks and we mention Mahamudra, is that much later? And how does that connect with our study of the Vajradhara and this lineage that we just read about for tonight? I'm trying to make a timeline.
I don't know, Michael. Can you answer that?
I'm not sure what the question is exactly.
Well, we referenced the Mahamudra,
Right.
and study the Vajrayana. How does that connect with the lineage that we read this evening?
Well,
Is it later in historically?
Yeah, it developed in India, and it was taught to the Tibetans. You see, what happened was that for our lineages, starting around the 1000s, Tibetans began to go to India to get the Buddhist teachings and bring them back for various purposes.
Okay.
So in the 11th century, Marpa, the translator, went. And he was really financially motivated. He was going to bring these back and teach them, but he got converted and became a great guru in his own right. But he studied with the great teacher Naropa and with others, and brought back a lot of teachings, including Mahamudra from India, where it had been developing. And there are other people who went to India too and brought back other teachings, or the same ones.
And they were, I'm sorry. So, but that was a bit later than this first round of the lineage of in Tibet. And
yeah, but you asked about the Mahamudra teachings. I mean, the first lineage in Tibet, starting in the 600s and then in the 700s. And what happened was that Buddhism had a slow start in the 600s, but it definitely had a start. You know, the king had this Buddhist princess as a wife, and he became a Buddhist. But in the 8th century, there was a king named Trisong Detsen, and he was a great Buddhist. And he brought a Mahayana teacher to Tibet, whose name was it Shantarakshita? Am I getting it right?
I think that's right.
And he was Mahayana, and the king was very pleased with him, and he started a monastery. Shantarakshita did, and he had some monks. He had ordained some monks, and they were trying to build the first monastery in Lhasa, which what's the name of the monastery in Lhasa?
Not the Patala.
Yeah, what?
Not the Patala.
No, not the Patala. Anyway, he was building the first monastery in Lhasa, But the story goes that they would build, the Hindus monks would build it by day, and then by night,
Samye Ling.
local deities would come and tear it down. Did you have the name? I'm just, no. And
Samye Ling, I think.
Samye Ling, excuse me. Yeah, that's the name of it, Samye Ling. And the local deities would tear it down, these Bun deities who didn't want Buddhism to come to Tibet. Later, Bun was incorporated into Buddhism, much later. So Shantabakshita goes to King Trisan Detsen, this is the lore, and says, look, I don't have enough power, you know. He said, you need somebody with more power, and there's this fellow in India whose name is Padmasambhava. Send for him. So King Trisan Detsen did, and Padmasambhava, who was a great, powerful fever speaker, came. And he conquered, he subdued all the deities and converted them, a lot of them, into Buddhism. So a lot of the protectors that we say chants to are from that tradition. They were converted to Buddhism by Padmasambhava and later other people. And Padmasambhava then established Buddhism in Tibet in the 8th century, and it started taking off until in the 900s there was an evil king who suppressed Buddhism, and it went underground. He was kind of, for those of you who are Jewish, the Haman of Buddhist lore. He was an evil king. But then there was this crazy monk whose name escapes me, I can't remember, who shot an arrow into this king's eye and killed him. And then slowly over the course of the later 900s and 1000s, Buddhism reestablished itself as the dominant religion of Tibet. You can read all this, and there are some wonderful history books. Which,
Yeah, and the Mahamudra tradition goes way back to India. Saraha, for instance, one of the great Mahasiddhas, is one of the. But there's an entire lineage to Mahamudra that I would have to look up to really thoroughly answer your question. But it is one of the main practices in the Kagyu tradition, or the main practice really in the Kagyu tradition. And there are a lot of different ways of practicing Mahamudra, so that even Vajrayogini and Chakrasamvara have a lot of elements of Mahamudra in that practice.
and as we may move as a Sangha here into the Vajrayana, we may be doing some practices with some of these figures, like Vajrayogini and Chakrasamvara. But Michael and I will, if we do decide to bring that in, we'll have to ring in some other teachers who are authorized to give the abhishekas and teachings.
So Miriam and Shini have their hands.
Yes, thank you for all this background. It's really fascinating. And I really appreciated the video as well to give us a sense of the conditions in which this took place. It's very rugged and harsh landscapes. And so it makes it all the more remarkable that this would have survived. Now, I had one question about the tantric practice of drinking unholy liquids or eating unholy meats. And I'm just curious about the symbolism of that. Is it like the things that you would oppose the most, you have to take it in as an utter acceptance, utter surrender? Like, what's the significance of that?
You want to take a stab, or shall I, Michael?
I think altogether the Vajrayana is about seeing the sacredness in all situations and coming to understand the enlightened nature of every situation, so that there's nothing that we shrink away from. I mean, in terms of the actual practice we do, it's symbolic. We're not actually doing those things here. I imagine probably it was done in some way in Tibet at one time, but it's a more, so I think it's that willingness not to shrink away from anything, not to reject anything. There's also, some idea as well that all of these substances in their hidden aspect, obscured aspect, actually represent different aspects of enlightened mind, and that it's because of our inability to see the enlightened aspect that we see them as repulsive substances, when in fact, if we could see things as they actually are, we would see them in a very different way. If John wants,
Great.
that's the best I can do.
And I'll just add that a lot of this path is about, we come to it with feelings of self-rejection and shame, self-hatred, lack of confidence. I've said before, in the Buddhist teachings, the greatest enemy is self-contempt, self-hatred. It's called the Gyalgan. And really what a lot of these tantric practices are about wiping that out, that division between what is holy and what is unholy. But in us, what is acceptable and what is unacceptable, the self-hatred, that is a huge barrier to enlightenment and a great fortress of ego. Ego lives on self-hatred. And so these symbols are really about consuming that.
Thank you. That's helpful. It sounds like the practices overall in Tantra are pretty confrontational, like dealing directly with what you might have rejected otherwise. Anyway, thank you.
Yeah, and your relationship with a tantric Vajra master can bring that home really, really powerfully, much more so than just a symbol or a ceremony, because it's real life with another human being.
Shinyi?
Yes, thanks. That was interesting question and answer, what you answered, Miriam. But I guess my question is, maybe also my comment is, just doing a reading and attending the class today and seeing a video, it strikes me how different the culture and the lifestyle was in Tibet, where things are much more simplistic. And especially I think in Tibet, there's a very supportive culture and community of practicing, doing retreats, studying, that has been established. And I guess also back then there was way less materialistic distraction, ordinary engagements. So just kind of thinking about that in contrast to our situation, especially in the West, and also in the modern world where things are getting faster, more materialistic, a lot of information, a lot of distractions. Is there anything good about this current age in terms of supporting our practice and study? Like, it's easier to access information, but I also think I personally waste a lot of time in just engaging other things. And yeah, I don't know. Is there, I guess also just alternatively, is there a way to work with our situation and make it more conducive to study and practice? Yeah, that's just a question.
I've said this before, but what Trungpa Rinpoche said on this point, at least part of it, is that the Tibetan people had a kind of naive mental health. It was naive because, you see, most of the people were living in subsistence conditions. They had to worry about their next meal and shelter and keeping their children, as healthy as they possibly could. And that kind of subsistence situation doesn't leave much room to get neurotic. Whereas in contrast, here in the West, we have so much material well-being that we have lots of room to get neurotic. And, you know, and he said, but so what happens is that the people in Tibet were sort of naively more sane, the peasants especially, than we are. But we have the time and the motivation to genuinely practice. So he felt it was an okay situation. But you do have to make the effort. You know, it takes an effort to find the time, the place, the resources.
I think that would be a great question to talk about and think about more tomorrow in discussion group.
Yeah.
But you're right, it is a different culture. And just another thing that I've always thought about is how Trungpa Rinpoche went from that culture to going to England in 1968 to coming to the United States in 1970 and being able to do all that he did in this culture that's so different is quite amazing, actually. Anyway, Dan had his hand up.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks, Michael, and thanks, John. That was really it's a fascinating introduction, like Miriam was saying. And Miriam's question, does that relate? There's either an instruction or a saying in the Vajrayana, poison is medicine. Are you familiar? Yeah, is that related to what Miriam was asking?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's that aspect. Definitely. Yeah.
Thank you. That was it. Yep.
I mean, that's why Amrita is made up of the 7 unholy liquors and Torma is made up of the 7 unholy meats. It's because they become the stuff of enlightenment when we stop rejecting them. I mean, how about the practice of chid, cutting up your body and offering it to the world while musical instruments are being played? My friend Sange Khandro is a great practitioner of chid. She teaches it, and I have friends who've done it. It's funny, for some reason, that practice is done more by women than men, and I have no idea why. Do you know, Michael? Well, there was a great teacher of chud who was a female in Tulku. Her name was Lapdran Machik.
Machik Labdrong?
Machik Labdran, that's it. Machik Labdran, sorry. And she has an incarnation who's alive and teaching today down in southern Colorado. Do you remember her name, Michael? I can't believe I'm blanking this. I knew her well.
Is that Elion? Elion?
No.
Yeah, Sultra Malioni.
Sultram, so that's it. Sultram Alioni. Yes. Sultram Alioni. And she was a nun, not anymore, who became a student of Trungpa Rinpoche very early on. And then much later was recognized to be a incarnation of this great teacher of Chid, Machik Labdran. And she has a center in down in southern Colorado near the New Mexico border. And she's written books. Sultra Malioni. One is Feeding Your Demons. That's what it's called. She's a Westerner, though, in spite of the name. She had a different name. She married a fellow named Alioni. at one point in her life. Well, perhaps any other questions? We could end a little early. Yes, Lane.
Just a comment. I forgot who you mentioned had the title of Hututu. I just wanted to offer that that's just the Mongolian word for Tulku.
Oh,
So some Rinpoches have that title.
thanks very much. What do you think, Michael? Should we say the closing chants then?
Yes.
Okay, I'll put them up. You lead us.
Okay. So we'll close by reciting a prayer for peace and dedicating the merit of our study and practice for the benefit of all sentient beings.
I'm going to mute everybody, Michael.
By the blessings of enlightened and compassionate ones, by the power of my positive actions of 3 times and my prayers of pure aspiration, may wars, conflicts, epidemics, and all other maladies dissolve in this world, and may the earth and all who live on this earth enjoy the abundance of well-being. May all learn to live lovingly with each other. By this merit, may all obtain omniscience, may it defeat the enemy wrongdoing. From the stormy waves of birth, old age, sickness, and death, from the ocean of samsara, may I free all beings. By the confidence of the golden sun of the great east, may the lotus garden of the Rigdon's wisdom bloom. May the dark ignorance of sentient beings be dispelled. May all beings enjoy profound, brilliant glory.
Michael and John. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks.
Michael.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Thank you,
Thank
John.
you.
Thank you, Michael.
Good evening.
Everybody. Thank you
muted,
so
John.
much.
Thank you.
Good night, all.
Thanks.
See you tomorrow.
See you tomorrow.
Tomorrow.